Well, hello, I'm Sue Stockdale. I'm the Association for Coaching podcast host, and today I have the pleasure of speaking to Brian Portnoy, who is one of the speakers at the Coaching in the Workplace conference. Brian runs a company, Shaping Wealth, based in Chicago, which provides financial wellness coaching and consulting for financial advisors and corporations. I want to explore with Brian what is the role of money in creating a happy life. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, I understand in your book, The Geometry of Wealth, you make an important distinction between being rich and being wealthy, which may relate to the concept of funded contentment that you describe. Tell us what that is. I haven't heard that phrase before.
Right. Well, you haven't heard it before because I made it up. but hopefully it taps into something that all of us have given consideration to from our own frames and through our own words. The distinction between being rich and wealthy is very important. For me, being rich is having more. It's a quest for more, not just more money, but the things that money buys. And there's a principle in psychology known as hedonic adaptation, which is the idea that we become used to just about everything that happens to us in life, both good and bad. And so, in terms of being rich and the chase for money, fame, beauty, accomplishment, those events or accomplishments tend to make us less happy than we think that they will. And I'll contrast that with being wealthy, which is the ability to underwrite a meaningful life. And my shorthand term for that is funded contentment. So we want to think deeply about what a meaningful life is. But then we have to recognize, unfortunately, that money is an inescapable topic in every dimension of our life. And so I've tried to put together not only some ideas, but some coaching programs that can bring people toward funded contentment.
So I get the sense then, the ability to be able to afford to be contented and relaxed in your life in a way.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, I think it's sort of a deliberately awkward phrasing on my part about the ability to afford meaning. But I think we have in society a general aversion to talking about money. It's not something that we're comfortable with. It tends to be the number one source of stress for individuals and families. And we're generally emotionally unprepared and analytically ill-equipped to have detailed and fulsome conversations about money. So I want to create a bridge that's comfortable for everybody to get into those conversations so that we can get to a better place.
That makes good sense, Brian. Tell us a bit about your background. I'm imagining there's a bit of coaching in there, psychology and finance. So what makes you the authority to tell us about this subject?
So I wouldn't say I'm the authority. I'm somebody who has, I think, some experience that might be relevant and helpful to others. So I've spent more than 20 years in the finance business, digging deep into investments. And somewhere along the way, I realized that investing wasn't the centerpiece of a healthy relationship with money, that there's a broader set of concepts that we need to deal with. And so starting about 10 years ago, I got into the field of behavioral finance, which is basically the combination of economics, finance, and psychology. It was a field invented by two Israeli psychologists named Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. And their research has spurred what is now a large and fascinating field of study that incorporates economics, psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and it's a very exciting cross-disciplinary field that gives us insight into why making money decisions is so hard. So starting about 10 years ago, I began to write my first book on applying some of those psychological principles to investment decision making. And then a few years ago, I wrote my second book, which does step back and develop this notion of funded contentment.
So is there a equilibrium point, Brian, where people get to have a certain level of salary or revenue income that means that then anything additional to that makes them less content? Or is there not such a thing?
It's a good question, and the answer is pretty complicated. So, there's a lot of study and consideration of the question: does money buy happiness? And my elegant, precise academic answer is not really, but kind of yes. So, one of the main findings is that beyond what we would consider, call it a middle class income, meaning that you have a nice roof over your head, your family is safe and comfortable, your kids go to a good school, you can afford a few nice things in life. Beyond that level of income and wealth, there is a ton of research that shows that anything in excess does not bring more happiness, because happiness in this narrower definition is really tied to our day-to-day ups and downs, good mood, bad mood, and that is ephemeral, that is fleeting. When we think about the attachment of money, both our income and the assets that we have, and the relationship to a bigger, more meaningful life, there things get pretty interesting. The scholarship is relatively new in asking that question, but there's positive findings that a meaningful life, which has a few different dimensions to it, we can afford more and more of that as we develop our income and our assets.
So, how do you measure happiness for yourself, Brian?
Wow. So we're going on the couch. Here we go. So I make a pretty important distinction between happiness and meaning, or happiness and contentment. So happiness to me is sort of the day to day, good mood, bad mood, and that comes and goes. We all actually have a psychological set point where some of us are just naturally cheerful and chipper, and others are just sort of dour and gloomy, and we are who we are. We're born that way, and we sort of, good and bad things happen that move us off center, but we always kind of come back to that. On the other side of the ledger, when I think about contentment, what I've written about for the last few years is that there's four sources of contentment. And this is just my perspective on a very big picture topic. I know others have different mental models or frameworks, but for me, I talk about the four C's, meaning connection, control, competence, and context. Maybe I'll say just a few words about each. And this is based on psychology, theology, literature, art, anthropology, and so forth. With connection, we need to recognize that we are social beings, not just because we enjoy others' company, but from a genetic hardwiring point of view, we are social creatures. And the need to be around others, that sense of belonging, is probably the deepest source of contentment in our lives. And part of the difficulty of the current crisis is that as we're being separated from our loved ones, it becomes very difficult. And we know in modern society, unfortunately, that one of the great quiet epidemics is loneliness. And there's a certain sad irony to the fact that as we're increasingly connected by technology, we feel increasingly isolated in our own places. Connection, very deep source of meaning. Second is control. Having autonomy, being able to chart your own course and tell your own story. People want to do what they want to do. From the beginning of it all, we value freedom and liberty, and we don't want that taken away from us. The third thing is competence, and that relates to the work that we do. And it could be your work, your job, your vocation, your craft, your serious hobby. But as human beings, we get a deep sense of joy out of doing something well that's very important to us. And again, that could be your career, it could be your craft, but that sense of flow that we sometimes get, that, for me, it's writing. For others, it's working in a corporate environment. For others, it's playing a musical instrument. It's completely in everybody's own personal terms. But that feeling that hours have just gone by and you didn't even notice that the clock was ticking because you were so wrapped up in something joyful to you, that's very, very meaningful. And so when we now think about the nature of modern labor markets, the gig economy, that is being called into question in terms of the attachment to the psychological attachment to our labor. And then last and quickly is context, which is a very big, deep idea that People who are attached and passionate about something beyond themselves tend to lead much more meaningful lives. I think over the millennia, religion and faith is the centerpiece of that, but we can have a connection to our faith, we can have connection to our nation or our community, we can have connection to our sports teams. It's a not trivial connection that many of us have, a loyalty to that group. So in brief, I think there are four underlying sources of contentment. And what I've done personally is kind of think through, well, what's been important to me over the years, and it evolves. Like sometimes work and that sense of flow is more important than connection to others. Other times it's all about family. It comes and goes. And what I tried to do is set up this broad, flexible mental model to give anybody the tool to think through what's important to them.
So I'm visualizing this as almost like a balance sheet or a mental checklist now, that I've got these 4 C's.
Yeah.
And on a daily or even weekly basis, I could be evaluating where the source of my happiness or even discontent's coming from.
That's right. And we can write down on a scrap of paper or in a notebook or in a digital journal what is important to us at any moment in time. It leads, I think, to good coaching practice, because when we then attach meaning to money, we can begin to think about in pretty concrete terms what we'll need to spend to underwrite whatever it is that's important to us. One piece of caution I'd say, though, is that we want to be careful about not putting some sort of numerical scale on this. The aim here isn't to take each of the C's and rank them 0 through 10 and feel that if you scored a 40, you've won the game of life. It doesn't work that way for many reasons, but one of which is quite practical, is that our need for belonging and our need for autonomy are actually to some extent in conflict with each other. And sometimes we want to be charting our own path, and sometimes we want to be part of the group. And at any moment in time, it's a little bit of a zero-sum proposition. So yes, from a journaling point of view, and also from a client coaching point of view, this becomes one of several tools that we can move people down the path toward financial wellness.
That sounds like a great tool and method that coaches can be cognizant of when they're working with their clients. I'm wondering also, Brian, how might a coach's own relationship with money influence how they then work with their clients? Have you got any sense of how that works?
I mean, I do, and I love the question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, because the coach on one side of the table or the phone or the Zoom, coaches are people too. And all of us have complicated relationships with money. Very few of us have thought through all of the different wrinkles of our relationship with the different dimensions to money. And there are many: saving, spending, earning, insuring, investing, charitable giving, and so forth. A lot of different dimensions. So one of the challenges here is that for coaches of financial wellness, they need to have some sense of self-awareness, which isn't to say that they need to stop being human, meaning that they can't just make their concerns and stress go away. But at the same time, having a sense of where you're coming from, what's important to you, what have been your triggers, how has your money life progressed over time. I think our ability to demonstrate and execute empathy or empathic coaching hinges on that level of self-awareness, because there's a very good chance that my perspective and my values aren't identical to yours. And if we're in a coaching or in a professional relationship, it's on me to be self-aware what implicit biases I might be bringing to the conversation, because it's not about me judging you according to my choices and my scales. It's about me bringing out in you what's most important and helping to articulate and envision the journey that you're on.
So really a coach would be wise to be working on themselves and increasing their own awareness, and how that may help or hinder the coaching relationship.
I think it moves things from good to great. I think the more self-awareness there is, the better a coach you can be. And again, because finances and money tend to be the most stressful issue in everyone's life, these are, so-called third rail topics. And we have to be comfortable first as professionals, as coaches, advisors, educators, to sort of absorb the shock of that third rail a little bit and realize that our client might be taking us somewhere that we ourselves are not terribly comfortable with.
I'm getting the sense money can be an uncomfortable subject for people to explore. Have you got any tips that can help coaches if they're working with clients to make it an easier entree into that type of conversation?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. One thing is to just take a historical or a lifelong view. I mean, there's something to be said, or there's a very long conversation to be had with most people about what their experience with money has been over time. So I have a particular story about the family circumstances in which I grew up and how money was part of that dialogue or that dynamic, quite dysfunctional to be honest. Giving someone permission to think about their life story in part through the lens of money begins to establish their story. And so, secondly, I'd say stories are very important here. We live by scripts. We're all participating in theater in one way or another. We know that as coaches generally. And so, figuring out the scripts by which we understand ourselves and by which we set goals, some of them very specific goals. I want to buy a new home. I want to retire at a certain age with comfort and dignity. There are narrative structures to all of those that we can unpack. And I'll just flag one, which is retirement. It's the number one goal for most people in a financial context. Number one, we have to recognize that going back just 150 to 200 years ago, there was no such concept of retirement. You worked till you died, or at least you worked till you couldn't work, but then you were part of a larger family unit that took care of you. And for a bunch of interesting reasons, not relevant to today, we have a modern retirement system, both public and private pensions and benefits that support us in our older age. And much of money life is defined by this one finish line at age 60 or 65 or whatever that age is. And we get there. Well, what is the story of retirement? I think at a very high level, the story is, well, I'm going to work until I don't work. I'm just, I want to save enough so I don't have to work anymore. Well, let's revisit the 4 C's and recognize that competence or flow is central to a meaningful life, that work is central to our identity. And so what you find, and there's a bit of a gendered dimension to this with men versus women. Historically, the dynamic's changing, but if you think about people in their 60s and 70s and 80s now, the gender balance in workplaces was different 30 to 40 years ago when they started their careers. You do something that's very meaningful to you. Of course, you complain about work, we all do, but you doing something that's meaningful to you, and then you want to make enough money so you could stop doing what's meaningful to you.
It doesn't make sense.
At some level, it doesn't make sense. And we have to question, why is it that you want to, quote unquote, stop working? What is it that you're going to gain? What is it that you're going to give up? Because I know in my own conversations with financial advisors and individual investors, there are people who do everything they should in terms of saving well, spending responsibly, earning, investing intelligently, and they get to age 62 or 65, and they're able to, quote unquote, retire. And what you hear the person say, and again, it's usually the man, he says, well, what's next? Especially we have blessing of longevity now. If you're going to live into your mid 80s to your mid 90s, late 90s, you still have 20, 30 plus years to go, maybe a third of your life to go. So if the idea is I'm going to give up something that's really important to me and not fill it with something else, then retirement actually becomes a source of disappointment. So the stories we tell about ourselves and these landmark goals, really important to unpack those.
I think the sense I'm getting from what you're saying today, Brian, is it really is about one's life story, and that we should be looking at it in the round rather than necessarily specific pinch points in our life or the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. But there's something about taking that broader, longer perspective that can be really helpful.
Yeah, the big mental model that I developed in the geometry of wealth, and it's captured through 3 basic shapes, a circle, a triangle, and a square, is the idea that what we want to do in order to reach funded contentment, to achieve financial wellness in a grand sense, is that we want to start by defining purpose. And then we want to move on to setting priorities, which is a little bit more granular in terms of goal setting, balance sheets, cash flows, budgets. And then we want to wrap up at the third step of making decisions, which is quite granular. And the thing is, it's iterated. It just never stops. The reason why the first shape is a circle is that we're always going around and around and figuring this out. And so the thing about financial wellness is that we start with the big picture story of ourselves, which in and of itself is sometimes difficult to unpack and articulate. It's super rewarding. That's hard in one way, and then it becomes hard in a different way because you then attach what's meaningful to you and the narrative arc of your life to specific financial objectives. And then you start getting into more of a planning conversation. And I would argue that true wealth is not achievable unless you've calibrated or aligned that sense of purpose with your specific plan. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish.
You left me really contented after our conversation today, Brian. It's been really good to hear your views on this. And I've got a new mental model now within which to think about financial wellness. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it.
It's my pleasure. What a great time. Thank you.